Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
So we're going to think about a bit of a different aspect of communication today, and I don't think one that we've mentioned before, and that's church meetings. And this is probably going to be different for different people. I mean, that's usually the case, but it may be that this is almost an alien thing to some people, that maybe you just don't have church meetings, maybe you don't have a membership in your church. But I think all of us can probably relate to sitting through like an AGM at some point in our life and trying not to fall asleep, looking down at the agenda, realizing that we're only on the second item and we're probably going to be there for at least another couple of hours. So I think it's helpful to share some things about church meetings that I have seen done really well, and try and make this a nice, encouraging thing rather than complaining about all the ways that we've seen it done badly.
Yeah, and I have to say, it's not to say the worst, but there is definitely that, like, when you've just had a Sunday service and then they have the AGM straight after, and they're
doing it on
you can
Sunday.
have a little bit of have a coffee quickly. Come on, we've got to now sit down, and you're like, I've had no chance to like even grab a snack or something. Yeah. Let's keep it short and sweet.
Yeah, I mean, foreshadowing there, we will be talking snacks later. But first of all, I think, given that we're a comms podcast, the importance of communicating things in advance. So this is something that I've seen done really well, where rather than just sending out your agenda, you actually send out almost like a précis of what we're going to cover in the meeting. It means that nothing in the meeting is a surprise. Mm-hmm. You can go too far the other way and you share so much that people go, well, why would I bother going to the meeting? And there's a balance to be had there. But I think it's really important to lay out what you're going to do. Let there not be any surprises for people, and try and answer some of the questions before they come up, because that's where the awkwardness and the tension and then potentially the conflict can come up, when there's these unexpected things that sort of sometimes people are trying to figure out for themselves as they're talking in front of the whole church. And it's already been thought of, it's already been answered, but they don't know that, they don't necessarily have that confidence. So in order to do this, you need to set your agenda obviously well in advance. Now, most churches will have rules, especially for the AGM, about when the agendas need to go out. For ours, it needs to be 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. So that's fine. You know that you've got that deadline to hit. But as you're setting it, be a little bit brutal as well. Obviously include the things that you need to, but there will be things that don't need to be there, that don't need to be in front of the whole church. So let's say you had to replace a broken kettle recently and get a bunch of new tea towels. Is that important?
Yes, obviously. Very important.
You would certainly notice that kettle was broken when you couldn't have your cup of coffee with instant coffee. But it doesn't need to be something which takes up space in the meeting in front of the whole church and takes up people's time. And then alongside this, it's setting a pattern for the any other business section. So if people suggest things in advance for the agenda, great. But have a deadline on that, and then give them a response on it as well. You know, if you're saying we're not going to include that in the agenda, at least explain to them why that is. Say it doesn't need to be in front of the whole church, or actually we're not quite ready for that yet. So explain that to people, but yeah, have a deadline and establish this culture where the AOB isn't just an excuse for anyone to have the floor and air their grievances, or, you know, try and sneak things in. However important that kettle is, however much they care about the fact that they went out and replaced it and bought the best kettle under the sun, this is not the place for it. And that might be a little bit awkward the first couple of times that you do it. It might be that you come to that last point of the agenda and people try to sneak things in, and you have to respectfully say, this isn't the time for that. And we need to submit it in advance. But once you get that into a rhythm, people will be used to it, and it's a really helpful thing to do.
Yeah. And I think as well, the other side of that, of if you're attending it, is about actually making sure that you're reading it so that you know what's going to be discussed, and so that if you're expecting people to air grievances or something, that actually that you... Or if it is a topic that you do have an opinion on, but actually you need to prepare it rather than just ranting, that actually you're making sure that you're prepared coming into a meeting where it's not just AOB, I'm going to share whatever I want, but actually I'm going to give a valued and thought through response to a point of discussion that is really important because it's within the agenda.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we'll come to sort of sharing the floor with people and also chairing itself in a minute. But I think for me, sometimes I have that burning response to what someone said because I know that they've not thought it through or they don't know that it's been thought through. But actually, it's not necessarily my place to share that right now. Let the person who's leading the meeting lead the meeting.
Yeah.
But this advanced communication, I think it's really important, and it sends a message that you've thought these things through before you're asking the church to think them through a lot of the time. And that can really help to build trust in your leadership, which we shouldn't take for granted. We're all human and we need to sort of buy in to leadership sometimes. But even more than this, communicating in advance shows that you respect people's time. We all have really busy lives. All of your church attendees will have really busy lives. You've got family, church, work, all the other commitments, and that takes up a lot of time and energy. So if you're able to keep the meeting to an hour rather than 3, that really helps to ease that pressure and show that you care about your people.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And actually it makes them people less reluctant to come to future ones.
Absolutely.
If they know, right, it's an intense, but it's a productive 1 hour meeting rather than a long drawn out 3 hours. And then they're like, no, I don't think I'm going to come along to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, maybe this is just a Baptist church thing. Sometimes I feel like we kind of drag it out because we feel like it needs to be long because we're doing church business. But like, if you're done in 25 minutes, cool. Like, pray and then go home. Maybe there isn't much on the agenda this month or this quarter or whatever. That's fine.
Yeah. I think that's an all church problem, not just a Baptist problem. I've seen it in a number of other churches.
So coming back to how the meeting is led and chaired or whatever you want to call it, have someone who is good at leading meetings do that.
Definitely.
Now, often by default, it will be the pastor. Sometimes by necessity, it will be the pastor because there might not be anyone else to do it, but it doesn't have to be. It makes sense for it to be someone who's in a leadership position. But let's not just assume that because someone's in a leadership position, they have the gift of just leading people through a meeting, chairing it. It's not an assumption. So maybe if that's you and you don't feel confident in this, practice it. I don't know quite what that looks like, but that, be in situations where you need to practice it. Think about it in advance. Think about being intentional about how you're leading, and maybe look up some training that might be sort of public speaking stuff. It might be mediation stuff, but it might just sort of be people skills and leading through. And a big thing is to stick to the agenda as well, because it's so easy, even as the person leading, to get distracted and go off topic. But you're never going to be able to keep to time if you don't keep to the agenda. And again, that's respecting people's time there.
Yeah, definitely.
But as important as it is for you to lead it well, it's actually really helpful to mix it up as well and bring other people in. So have people contribute about things that they are passionate about. If there's something they've been organising and it's worth sharing and being on the agenda, then have them explain it. They'll do a better job and they will probably enthuse people more than you because they know more about it.
If they're super passionate about the kettle.
Exactly. If it's worth being on the agenda. So often we will see this with like the church treasurer, because like no one who doesn't really understand or care about the finances wants to be the person who's sharing about the finances. So the church treasurer will come up and speak about that. And that's a really important one. It's really important to update the church on these. At the same time, prep your contributors. So know that they don't have to share every detail, and that a really quick, like 5 minutes is more than enough for a finance update, unless you're going through some like really complicated building projects or something like that. But even then, if you can't say it in 5 minutes, then it probably should have been an email before, So yeah, prep people and then give people the option to ask questions afterwards. Again, we've all been in situations where maybe the treasurer's done a really good job. They've been really concise. You've gone, oh, okay, actually that makes sense. I didn't switch off. I didn't fall asleep once during that update. But then someone asks the most inane question that really has no relevance to anything, and probably, if we're honest, was already answered in the 5 minutes. And that 5 minute then turns into a 10 or 15 minute section. So yeah, give people the option to ask questions, but ask them to do it afterwards if it doesn't need to be said in front of everyone. And that's not just true of finances. For anyone who you are asking to take part in the meeting, make sure that they know what they are communicating. Make sure that they know what they are trying to get across, not just in terms of information, but how we want people to feel about it, how we want people to come away and feel enthusiastic and passionate about it. And then remind them that they've got quite a short time to do that in, so they have to be concise.
Yeah. And actually, it's probably people will remember a concise 5 minutes. Oh, actually, do you know what? Finances, we are in a bit of a sticky point. We're going to have to do some fundraising or something. But here are some options. I don't know. But you remember that in 5 minutes rather than someone waffling on about, well, we had some money and then the money's gone and then we got some more money and it's just this and that. And you're like, I don't know what's going on now. Partly because I have experienced that before, not in finances explicitly, but it's just you're like, I don't know what was the conclusion of that because you were talking for 15 minutes about something that I am not particularly enthused about.
Yeah. And the AGM is generally, the worst culprit for this because they have elements in that other meetings might not, that you've got a reflection on the year or your report on the year and that sort of thing. And those things are great. Again, they can go out in advance, so you don't need to read them out word for word during the meeting. Even if they're minuted, have them minuted as an appendix or something like that, But yeah, I think it's just remembering that more words about something doesn't mean that it's actually going in and being more clearly communicated, and sometimes less is more.
Yeah. And I actually think that's particularly important for an AGM where everyone has to attend it. And so it's a lot of people who aren't, say, that involved in the finance or the building project or recruitment or something. Whereas a normal trustee meeting, generally everyone is fairly switched on. So you could have maybe invested. A bit more of a discussion because actually, or you don't have to say much because they know what's going on. Whereas an AGM, you do have to inform people if they've not been told in a year. But equally, they're not going to be as attuned to what was happening, but they have to kind of be informed.
And I think whilst in our minds, as we've been preparing this episode, we've been thinking about those sort of bigger whole church meetings, at the same time, a lot of this advice can apply to smaller meetings, whether it's your ministry or a staff team, if you're lucky enough to have a staff team. These same things apply. Getting an agenda out in advance will mean that you can have a half-hour meeting rather than a 2-hour meeting.
Yeah.
So it can be helpful to open up the floor for comments at a church meeting, but we probably also can recognise that it can be really unhelpful as well. And maybe it's as simple as just a bit of a waste of time. And maybe people are kind of rolling their eyes a bit. Or maybe it's discussion about something quite sensitive, which, if we're really honest, doesn't need to be discussed openly and publicly. Church meetings can get heated. And that's not always avoidable, but it can be managed. So knowing when and when not to open up to the floor for comments, questions, discussion is really helpful, and something that you really need to think about in advance rather than on the fly. Just because someone has a burning question doesn't mean that it's the time for them to ask it. So if something is likely to be controversial, definitely communicate it in advance, as we've said. Give people the time to mull it over, to think and pray about it, rather than having to process that during the meeting, which is always going to be more pressured and people will be more reactive. And if there are particular people in the church who are going to find the direction the church is going in or proposing to go in difficult, then meet with them before and discuss it with them and explain why the church leaders are going in that direction, or why you're proposing that the church votes that you go in that direction, depending on your model of leadership. Having at least an agreement of peace from those people, even if it's not complete buy-in and agreement with you, will go a long way to avoid those really tense moments.
Yeah.
And then I'm saying this less so about those tense moments, but just generally, if you are giving people the microphone, if you are letting them speak to everyone, just know that it's okay as a chair to wrap them up. Sometimes having a physical microphone that you pass around is quite helpful for this, because you can use your body language to kind of take it back. Yeah, or, like a fishing rod or something. So you have to be sensitive with this. You don't want to shut people up, but it is okay to move on with the meeting. Otherwise, you'll be there all night.
I think also if it's, I'd never thought about actually speaking to someone beforehand, but I suppose what you can do as well is, especially if it's a highly sensitive, it's probably the wrong word, but a highly
Emotive.
responsive, topic, that you can say to people, look, we're informing you, like at the meeting, we're informing you now, this is it, please go away, pray about it,
Absolutely.
think about it, then email me, or I don't know, have a date where people, you're not saying we're not taking questions, full stop, end of discussion, but actually you're forcing people to think about it, because half the time, I imagine, if someone has a very emotive response to a situation, it's because it's emotional, and that's it. Will you explain to them and they go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense, okay. Whereas actually if you give them a chance to think about it, or if it's like they email it, actually you've got a chance to email something back and think it, rather than having to kind of answer, in front of everyone, where perhaps actually you do need a bit of like time to think about how you respond to it.
Yeah. Church leaders are very good at, when they're making decisions, especially over these big things, trying to think through all the scenarios, trying to think who's going to be upset with this, why, what can we do about that? Is it still the right thing? Is it still God's will for us? The problem is that process might take 6 months, but to the person who's hearing about it for the first time in a members meeting, they don't know any of that context. So yeah, absolutely, being prepared enough to bring something to your church, not for action, but for contemplation, that you're then going to bring in the future. And that's not just for decisions either. Again, whether the church is making the decision as a body, or whether leadership are making the decision, again, it depends on how you operate. But we had something recently where someone was becoming a member of the church. There was a difference of theology. It was completely fine within the church rules. So it wasn't controversial in that sense. Like, he will become a member. And yet it was sensitive, because there would be people who didn't agree with that. And so bringing it less for discussion, but more for notice, and to show that it has been thought through and explain how it has been thought through, got ahead of it so that it doesn't have that potential to become an issue. Yeah. But it does, that sort of thing does require being organised and thinking ahead on things. And if there's a decision that you need to make that you haven't got the luxury of waiting 3 or 4 months till the next church meeting, that you can bring it up and then wait to the next one, then sometimes that's not always possible. But yeah, it's the importance of working in advance.
Yeah.
And when the church is making a decision actively as a membership or a congregation that you are voting on something, the same is true. So if you're coming into a meeting and you're really nervous about a vote or the discussion that's going to happen before a vote, the chances are that you could have prepared the church better for that point, and maybe you haven't prepared them enough to have the vote. Sometimes we do have to have those difficult votes, and it's going to be at the point where you can't get everyone peaceful about it. There's going to be disagreement. There's potentially going to be division, and sometimes we have to have those difficult votes. But a lot of the time, we can prepare the ground first, and if there's not an urgent deadline to vote tonight, then it can wait. But bringing things to a slightly less tense sort of, atmosphere, try a different sort of environment for your meetings. So you can have things which are more relaxed and less businessy. Our church has dessert together before the meeting.
Nice.
And people bring desserts, and that's all organised. It means that you need to know who's coming in advance. It's a bit more work, but it means that it's a more enjoyable occasion.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have to be. I mean, some churches call it a church business meeting. That's fine. You're doing church business there, but it doesn't have to look like a business meeting. It doesn't have to be formal. It can be about fellowship as well. And so, some churches will do this by opening with a time of worship and reflection, and that's really nice. Basically, it's see what works for your church. Again, as tend to be held in the coffee shop area of the church rather than sitting down in rows and that sort of thing. And all of these things can just help the church to come together more, but also can help to avoid it feeling like there's stuff which is going to happen and we're not sure about it, and therefore we're kind of on guard and that sort of thing anyway. And so the last point then that we can make on meetings is include prayer. That obviously goes for before in your preparation and praying for the people who are going to be there. But at the meeting itself, I think most church meetings are probably likely to at least open and close with prayer, but that doesn't have to be it. Again, our church intersperses prayer throughout. So we'll have 1 or 2 agenda items, and then we will either in groups or have someone with the microphone will pray for those items. And that's really nice because it reminds us all what we're doing, why we're doing it, and brings it back to that vision and seeking God's will for things. So yeah, whatever that looks like for your church, make sure that prayer is there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So members' meetings can be a bit of a chore, even if you do all of these things. Like, they're not always the most exciting things in the world, but hopefully if we're preparing in advance and we're just thinking about the way that we run the meeting, the atmosphere that we run it in, and what we actually include, then yeah, it can be maybe slightly more enjoyable thing for everyone.
Gourds and Pomegranates is brought to you by Joe Gallant and Hannah Fleming Hill. You can find episode transcripts and contact the show via gppodcast.uk.